Hello, everyone. This is a recorded version of our presentation for the Canadian Psychological Association held in Toronto, June 2023. My name is Connor Chahowski. I'm a doctoral student in clinical psychology at the University of Ottawa. My pronouns are he. And those who are a visual description of me for those who are visually impaired. I'm wearing a colorful collared shirt. I have a beard and brown hair. Go ahead, Mark.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Gardina. My pronouns are they, them, and he, him. I am a community member and research participant. Visual description of what I look like is I am a white non-binary person with a brown mullet, wearing glasses, and wearing a colorful green button-up shirt.
So researchers have increasingly over time been recognizing the importance of making sure to represent trans and non-binary identities in research. And as recommendations are developing, the extent to which recommendations involve people who are trans and non-binary, especially larger samples of those folks and their perspectives, is unclear. Why is this important? Well, if we don't have accurate representation, or if we don't have the means to represent people accurately in our research, so if we don't ask the right questions to get an accurate representation, then that could cause harm to those communities, especially if they're reading questions and they're not able to actually represent themselves correctly. And we'll get into that more later. From a research standpoint, if we do not ask the right kinds of questions to allow people to represent themselves accurately, we may misrepresent our data, and that results in poor quality data. So from a research practices standpoint, it's also important to consider how we collect our data and how we analyze our data to ensure that it's as accurate and complete as possible.
So to define our terms a little, what is trans and non-binary? So trans is a gender that is different from one assigned at birth, such as trans man, trans woman, often used as an umbrella term for other genders. Non-binary is a gender identity that does not fit in the binary, hence non-binary. For a list of more comprehensive definitions, you can check out the QR code here, and we'll have a list of many other resources you can access there as well.
So for our actual study, we wanted to identify how data from the trans and non-binary community should be included in research in two ways, in ways that are acceptable to the community and people part of the community, and ways that are accurate from a research standpoint. So this was a two-part participatory action research design. Participatory action research design really means that we involve people who are part of the affected community. We involve participants at every stage of the way throughout the research process. And that also includes ensuring to the greatest extent possible that people on the research team also have lived expertise to contribute. And so this really means starting from developing research questions, where we had some people on our team who, and still do, who are part of the trans and non-binary community, all the way up to now where we are analyzing our data, interpreting our data, and knowledge mobilization as well. We started with 15 interviews with people who are trans or non-binary. After each interview, I asked each one of those people if they were interested in continuing to contribute to this project. And several of them did volunteer to either consult or even more meaningfully, or at a higher level, contribute to the analysis, such as Mar. And then as we developed the online survey, we really aimed to confirm a lot of our findings or seek to get more in-depth perspectives from a much larger sample of people.
So to give you a brief snapshot of a few of our research participants, you can see a table here with a few examples, taking James, who's 23, whose gender identity is a trans man, whose gender expression is feminine, and uses he, him pronouns. We can see that this illustrates that all of the research participants you may have at any given point will have a diversity of gender identities and gender expressions, and that this is all valuable data that you may want to try and include in your research.
As far as the interview data is concerned, from those 15 people that I interviewed, here are some main themes from that data, main results that emerged from that data. First, a lot of people talked about how data should accurately reflect identities. So that means including expansive gender identity options. Basically, people really appreciated being given the opportunity to indicate what their actual gender identity is, rather than just having a couple of options. Practices should minimize harm. There's a number of ways that practices could minimize harm. One of those is really just staying up to date on what accurate terminology is, for example. Some people also suggested that when certain more sensitive questions are asked, maybe something such as bathroom use or something like that, it's really important that people do first justify why they're actually asking this question. So as a reminder, this study is about these sensitive issues, and that's why we're going to ask you about these sensitive questions, so people have this idea of, why are they actually asking me this question, to increase trust. And that brings me to the third point: informed practice increases trust. Practices can be informed in one of a couple of ways. First, again, just staying up to date on best practice literature to be as informed as possible, use the right words, to use the right terms. That would increase trust. But even more so, making sure to involve people from the community itself is certainly a way to actually increase trust. So then we move on to the online survey. So the aim here was to seek feedback from a broader sample. So we got lots of suggestions, lots of ideas, and lots of potential avenues for study in the 15 interviews. And then we aimed to just duplicate that or confirm those findings or go deeper on a larger sample. We especially wanted to learn a little bit about appropriate terminology, evolving appropriate terminology. If or how to subgroup people within the trans community. So from a research standpoint, given that a lot of our research is based on group-based analysis, are there good ways to actually subgroup the community, or should we even subgroup the community from a research standpoint? And ways to reduce potential for harm. So are there certain research practices that may inadvertently cause harm to people who are, for example, reading the questions or being asked certain questions, and how to mitigate that possible harm? So here we have our online survey sample, just a bit of a snapshot. I really wanted to include here on the left hand of your screen, you can see we have all 392 people represented in that table, and they were given the opportunity to, in an open-ended way, just write their gender identity. There was just enough space for maybe one or two identities, and almost everybody selected only one identity. So then we have the example of when we later asked them, please select all that fit. You can see that that number adds up to 834, which means that a lot of people gave more than one identity, sometimes 3 or 4 identities. So this is just an illustration of once people were given the opportunity and encouraged to select all that fit, rather than just implying with a smaller space, please write out your gender, people had an opportunity to be a lot more accurate with what their identity is by selecting multiple options. Some other information about our sample characteristics: the age mean was almost 30 years old. The vast majority of people were from the United States, some from Canada, and some from elsewhere, mostly majority English-speaking countries. When we asked people about their pronouns, about 35% of the sample did indicate that they use traditional gendered pronouns. And then the majority did mention that they use either alternative or non-binary pronouns, as you can see in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So just based on what I just talked about there, we also asked people how important is it for researchers to include all of the following gender identity options, and we included the ones that we had put there. And you'll see that very consistently, people tended to say that they're quite important. So each one of these is an average of people's responses from not important to very important. And you could see that pretty consistently across the board, people are fairly confident that it's important that we include each and every single one of these. Next, we ask about what kind of terminology is acceptable for researchers to use when writing about the trans community as a whole. So just when referring to the trans community in general, what kind of terminology is appropriate and which terminology is not appropriate? And you can see here that there's a lot more variability in these responses. What's also really interesting is that the error bars that represent standard deviations, for those that scored lower, so maybe we're just a little bit under neither acceptable or unacceptable, such as transsexual on the left over here, you can see that the standard deviations are much higher, which means that people had much varied responses. And a lot of the time this was skewed to the negative. So a lot of people just did view this as completely unacceptable, which accounts for the larger standard deviations and different consistencies in terms of responses.
So to go over a few of the terms and why they are mentioned as less acceptable, either neither acceptable or unacceptable or completely unacceptable. Transsexual is a term that is, before I mention this, I will say that this is recommendations for researchers. And if you do hear of trans people using these terms for themselves or as a self-descriptor, it may be in a reclamatory way. And to keep this in mind, that this is, again, recommendations for researchers and not necessarily for trans people. So transsexual is, being trans is not a sexuality, it's a gender. So transgender, transgendered. Once again, you are not transgendered as a gender. It's not something that's done to you passively. You are transgender or not. Gender minority. Minority often has more of a negative connotation to it, so less recommended. And folks with an X instead of folks has been seen to be more performative than impactful, as the use of the X does not create any meaningful or actionable change apart from the change of the spelling.
Next, we asked how helpful would certain practices make people in our sample feel more at ease when participating in research. Each one of these recommendations came directly from the 15 interviews that we had. And we just wanted to see on a larger sample, on average, would people also find these fairly helpful or not? And as you can see, people did find that most of these fairly helpful, and Mar will highlight a few of these as well.
Yeah, so to go through a few actionable things you can do as a researcher to help make trans and non-binary people feel more at ease. So number one, being up to date on the current language at all stages of your research, from the language you use in an interview to the language you use in writing your paper. Having a trans study recruiter as well as a trans interviewer. Seeing that there is a trans person involved in the core leadership of your team would, at least personally, make me as a trans participant feel more at ease knowing that there's another trans person who is okayed on a lot of this in the process. And begin the interview by stating pronouns. This is a standard practice of information that you'd want to know about somebody, and knowing that the interviewer is modeling this behavior would then hopefully help a person feel more at ease, also knowing that their pronouns are going to be respected and that they're welcome to also share.
Then we also asked if it would be acceptable to subgroup the trans community in one of two groupings. We've noticed this has been used in the literature. This was also when just discussing in an open-ended way if we can or should, and if we can, how actually subgroup the trans community. This was a suggestion that was often discussed by the 15 participants about maybe splitting the community into people who identify as trans-binary, so someone who identifies as exclusively man or woman, and non-binary identities, so someone who may identify more as a somewhere in between, or maybe a mixture of the two, so not quite neatly fitting into one of the two binaries of man, male, or woman, female. People were given the option of responding either yes, no, or they could also check both, yes and no. And whatever response they gave, they were then asked, please let us know why you chose this response. And so that gave us open-ended responses, where then Mar and I collaboratively, qualitatively analyzed all of those responses to generate some themes to summarize and better understand how people responded. And Mar will take us through some of those results.
Yeah, so to go through the themes found in the yes responses to this question, the first theme we identified is yes, it is accurate to subgroup into trans, binary, and non-binary because there is a misalignment of the binary that the experience of binary people aligns with the experience of cis people, and non-binary experiences by definition do not align with cis or trans binary experiences. We can see some quotes here that illustrate this from a few participants. The second theme we identified in response to the question yes, because it's used a lot. Many simply stated that this grouping is acceptable because it's already used widely in social contexts or otherwise. Other themes identified in the yes response, the third theme is that, yeah, it's good enough, or it's imperfect, but it's accurate because it's good enough. And the fourth theme identified is that it's just accurate, and that it's a sensible division, or that it's accurate without elaborating further. Themes identified in response to the question no, it's not accurate to subgroup into trans-binary and non-binary. The first theme is that it's an oversimplification because some people do identify with both binary trans, such as a trans man, and non-binary. Personally, I identify as a trans masculine person, but also am non-binary. So some people may still blur that line is an example that that quote illustrates. The second theme is it's an oversimplification because some identify with none of these. So what does that look like? Gender fluid people, agender, two-spirit people may represent this as well, depending on the two-spirit person and how they feel. So it's an oversimplification because it also lacks the categorization to this group of genders. The third theme is that's an oversimplification because it excludes shifting identities. For some, identities shift and change over time, such as gender fluid people whose gender may shift between masculine, feminine, or otherwise, or closer to neutral. We can see other quotes illustrating that here as well. The final theme we identified is that no, it's not accurate to subgroup into trans-binary and non-binary because respondents responded that they reject the creation of another binary. Some rejected the premise of the question and that the proposition does create another binary. Indeed, many have made an effort to reject the cis male or female binary, and many people's identities or existences seek to disrupt these as a whole. So that raises the question, why would we propose a new one in the first place? So to go over a few of the practical recommendations that we would recommend based off of this study, as mentioned before, the first recommendation is to use multiple inclusive gender identity options. So what could this look like? We can see here, based off of the responses, respondents mentioned of gender identities that are most important to list as options in your list of genders. This drop-down menu of checkboxes, importantly, so that participants can check all of the options that may fit and represent the broadest variety of their gender identities. If they do not have an option that accurately, if you as a research participant, if you as a researcher do not have an option that applies, allowing the participant to also have a fill blank box so that you can enter the participant can enter the gender or information that they feel best accurately represents them as well would be important and helpful. The second practical recommendation would be to not use outdated language, such as mentioned, transsexual, transgender, gender minority, or folks with an X. Again, the QR code mentioned before with the list of resources around latest terminology around gender terms, gender identities can be found here. And the third recommendation is for in-person research, whether focus groups or interviews or otherwise, consider transparency about why sensitive questions are asked and justifying the reason as to why you are choosing to ask sometimes sensitive or invasive questions. Number two, remaining up to date about evolving language as mentioned. And number three, including people from the trans and non-binary community as collaborators, such as this research study has done, and which anyone can do any way along the way, whether that's ensuring that you have a focus group panel advisory committee of the group that you are doing the research on to advise you on, and making sure that you compensate these people, of course, or obviously having community participants involved in the research and the coding or the presentation or other ways, all meaningful and valuable ways to do that. So yeah, these are our recommendations. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Thanks a lot for taking that time to listen, and we hope that you found these recommendations and the research useful to your practice. Thanks.